Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next webinar in our series. This time, we will be focusing on how to tell your organization's financial story. I'm Michael Cass. I am a consultant with Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I'll be guiding us through this discussion today. So before we start, as always in these webinars, I'd like to take a moment to offer an acknowledgement to the land and its people and its history. So I'm recording this from the traditional ancestral lands of the Tewa people. Today it's known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'd like to offer you a moment just to connect with the land. If you don't know whose land you're on, you can go to this URL at the bottom of the page, native-land.ca. I want to read this quote because I think it's a really beautiful explanation of why we start with these land acknowledgements. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. And I'd add to that because the topic of this webinar is storytelling, financial storytelling, that understanding that broader context, the story that we're all operating inside of, is even more important. So before we go any further, I'd like to invite us just to slow down, take a slow breath together, and then we'll get into the material. Thank you. As you know, these webinars have been put together and hosted by Nonprofit Finance Fund. We have a large portfolio of different things that we do as an organization, and it was not always this way, right? 40 years ago when the organization was founded, we had a very narrow scope of work, very narrow vision of impact. And as that evolved in response to the needs of the community over time, not only did our business model change, not only did our offerings change, but the stories that we told about our mission, about our work, and the financial story that drove all of that shifted as well. And so a lot of what we'll be going over today are the exact strategies and thought processes that Nonprofit Finance Fund has gone through ourselves as we've evolved over the years. Our learning objectives for today are first to talk about how we can use data to facilitate powerful strategic conversations, because before we can tell a story about our finances or decisions we've made, we have to actually make those decisions. So that's where we'll start. Tools to help us facilitate powerful decision-making conversations. Then we'll look at financial stories, and we'll look specifically at the components of those stories, where to find all the data and information that goes into the stories. And finally, we'll look at how to tailor financial stories for different audiences, including looking at a few different case studies. So let's look at a very simple, powerful tool that can help make difficult decision-making conversations accessible to people at all levels of your organization, from staff to board, even clients, depending on the type of organization you are. So in this tool, you'll see that along the left side, we have the criteria that will impact the decision. Now, you can put any criteria that's relevant to your organization over here on the left. For this case study, here are the criteria they've chosen: the impact on the mission, the impact on staffing, right? The impact on our human resources, the time horizon, how soon or far away the impact will take place, the risks that may or may not be involved in taking the action or playing out the scenario under consideration, and the financial impact of the decision or scenario. So in this scenario, we have an organization that at the beginning of the pandemic had to decide whether to cut a program completely, at least for the year, or to pivot to an online program for youth. In going through this analysis, they decided that the mission impact would be both positive and high. It would allow them to connect with students, and it's also a program that's core to their mission. So it's a really high impact there. The staffing impact would be minimal. And the reason that staffing impact is minimal is that they already have the staff needed to create this new program. So they wouldn't be bringing anyone on. They wouldn't let anybody go. The time horizon would be immediate for fall implementation. And this is a low risk scenario. And the reason it's low risk is really important. First, they already have experience in developing online programs. If this were different, right? If the organization didn't have any experience in online programs, it might be a higher risk. And the other, and this is really key, is that they already have a curriculum built and the funding has already been identified and committed. So they don't need to go out to spend money that may have been dedicated elsewhere or do any extra fundraising for it. That money's already committed. And finally, the financial impact would be neutral because the $5,000 in startup costs have already been committed and teacher salaries are already in the budget, right? So that's the first scenario this group is looking at. The second scenario is to pause their youth sports program altogether instead of trying to move it online. This would have a negative impact that would be high because the program is critical to their mission, right? So all of a sudden, one of their core programs would simply go away. The staffing impact would be moderate. It would affect 4 of their staff, and either those staff would have to be eliminated or moved to part-time. The time horizon would also be immediate, and the risks here, interestingly, are also low. And the reason the risks are low is that peer programs are also pausing. So the others in the area are also not continuing their core programs. And funders are supporting general operating support, so they won't lose any dedicated funding. And finally, families are in an alternative program, meaning they're not ultimately going to lose relationship with any of their students or families. The financial impact here is really interesting. It's a 10% savings of their overall budget with uncertain revenue and would be more costly to deliver this year. So they would actually save 10% of their overall budget by cutting this program. So looking at these scenarios, take a moment and see what decision seems right for this organization. So when I look at it, my mind immediately goes, well, clearly it's this first one. We should absolutely start the new online program for youth, right? There's tons of benefits and no drawbacks. But what I don't know, and the data we don't have in this, is how significant this 10% savings is, right? If this is an organization that's in financial distress, that 10% savings may mean the difference between keeping their doors open and needing to close. Either way, being able to lay out the complexity of these situations in this clear tool can really help the organization, and again, board, staff, whoever's involved in these decisions, grapple with them in a way that is comprehensible, because often the details get really muddy when we're involved in these conversations. So one of the keys to this kind of conversation is that there are always trade-offs. No scenario is perfect, right? So in the scenario we just looked at, that 10% savings may be pivotal. And in order to get it, we need to cancel one of our core programs, right? And the other thing that's really key here is to iterate on these, because these considerations and the impact of a scenario may change with an influx of money, or with the unexpected loss of funding, or with new partnerships or opportunities that may become available. So the analysis that we do on one day, 2 weeks later, we might want to iterate on it and reconsider what the impacts might be on the various criteria that we've decided to use. The other thing that's really, I think, important to consider in this conversation of these decisions is that these are not, as clean as that chart might look, these are not simple conversations. These conversations have implications for our people, for our mission, for the people that we serve. And so they can be emotionally charged, right? When the stakes are high, so are the emotions and the interests. So here are 5 things that we found really useful to think about in facilitating these conversations. The first is to simply acknowledge the emotion and everyone's interest in the situation, right? Let's, in other words, to move away from trying to treat it as a clinical conversation and really acknowledge that there are emotions and humanity involved. The second is to clearly articulate everyone's role. Make sure that board members know what their role is, staff knows what their role is, management knows what their role is, right? In other words, sometimes the board of directors wants to get in the nitty-gritty and ask questions like, why are we spending $57 on stamps? That's not their role. And it's really important that they understand that so that they can focus their attention where it's most useful. If we can get everyone in the room to agree on the goal of the conversation before we go into it, in other words, at the end of an hour, we will have made a decision, or at the end of half an hour, we will at least decide the criteria that we're going to use for our decision-making conversation. Getting everyone to agree on the goal is important, so we have everybody rowing in the same direction. And if we can't all agree on the goal, at least agree on the guide rails, right? The basic rules of engagement, the basic topic of conversation, what is off limits and what is open for conversation. And finally, instead of making the decision at pace, right? There can be this huge sense of urgency around these conversations. There's always the invitation to sleep on it and come at it the next day with clearer view, clearer eyes. So now that we've talked about how do we make these decisions, we're going to talk about the stories we can tell to various audiences that help them understand why we've made these decisions and help enlist their support of our mission, of our work, and of the direction we've chosen. And the reason that we focus on storytelling is that unlike any other form of communication, especially communication that puts data or facts first, stories can appeal to people's emotions. Stories influence the way that we see the world. They can find our way to human hearts and heads in a way that very few other communication methods can, right? They can create context, provide meaning and purpose, create connection, and most importantly, move others to act. I like to think of story as the basic building block of community. And anytime we're going to folks, whether it's a board member, a funder, or even staff members, right? What we are doing when we communicate is trying to build community around a decision, around our mission, around our cause. And so story is absolutely pivotal to that. Now, when we talk about financial stories, things shift a little bit, but not that much. See, a financial story isn't a story about a budget. It's not a story about numbers. Instead, we think of it as the story of your organization, the story of your mission, told through the lens of finance, right? Very different than telling, for example, a budget narrative, which is just a line-by-line recounting of the money you're spending and where you're spending it. This is really much more about your mission and the link between your work and the financial reality of your organization. One way to think of it is this way, right? Our financial decisions are here at the root of everything we do. They influence our payroll, they influence the amount we spend on marketing, they influence the amount we spend on our programs. So we want to make sure that people understand how our financial decisions are aligned with our values, our mission, and our vision, right? And the financial story is what creates that sense of alignment. It helps people understand the relationship between all the moving parts of our organization. And when we think about financial storytelling, there's really 3 financial stories we can tell, right? And these 3 are part of what we would consider to be a comprehensive financial narrative. The first is, what are the trends, right? How is our business performing? And in the case of many of our organizations, those trends may have shifted abruptly in 2020, right? What was our response to those trends? And what was the effect we were aiming for with that response? If we pivoted, like the organization in the example we looked at did, to offering online programs, what was the expectation of the results that that decision would produce, right? So that's the past. Then we look at the business model. That's where we are now. How do we make and spend money in support of our mission? Are we bringing in more money than we're spending? And how does whoever your audience is, whether it's a funder, board member, staff, or client, fit into this business model, right? So in the business model conversation, we want to make sure that we're being relevant to our audience. And finally, evolution. How is our organization, how is our business model evolving over time to meet its vision of the future, right? And what do we need to realize this vision for the future? If we're going to continue to evolve and shapeshift and serve our community in the most powerful way possible, what do we need in order to do that? And once we have these three stories, we've assembled our comprehensive financial narrative. So those are the three stories we can tell. Let's take a look at where to find the information that feeds into each of those stories. So that first narrative of trends, looking in the past, what have been the biggest events or changes, positive or negative or indifferent, in the past 1 or 2 years? And what has the effect of those events been on your financial health? And again, here you may have two separate sets of trends. You may have everything up until 2020, and then a shift, and then a different trend came in, and you want to explain that. In order to find the information for that, you'll want to look at your past income statements, past balance sheets, past audits, all of those pieces that tell us where the organization has been in its development as a business. Then we look at the present. That's our current business model. How did we address COVID-19? How maybe are we addressing climate change, right? What are we doing now in real time to adapt to the changing situation around us? And what is the impact of social distancing and various COVID precautions been on your organization, right? How are we doing today? And in order to find that information, we'll look at our current and revised budget. We'll look at cash flow projections. And we'll look at our most recent balance sheet, again, to get a sense of how much money is flowing out of the organization and how much money is flowing in, right? And how is the story that we're inside of, the world around us, impacted by that? And then finally, we'll look towards the future, the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, even 12 months, right? What will we need in the future to keep our program operating in a good way? And how will those changes affect our income or balance sheet? Right? Are we going to be expanding, adding programs? Are we drawing back in order to weather the proverbial storm, right? What are the decisions that we're making now that will influence our ability to grow and serve the community in the future? And for those questions, we'll look at our future projected budgets and our scenario plans, right? Our scenario budgets have all of that information. And again, this isn't just financial information. This is about the long-term viability, future, and impact of your mission. So those are the three types of stories that we can tell: the past, the present, and future, and the information we need to tell all of them. We can tell any number of stories with that information. So it's really important to know who we're developing the story for. And there are really two main buckets of audience that we're going to be talking to. The first is internal, our board, our staff, our volunteers. And for that, we may want to be focusing everyone on our priorities, right? What is it most important for us to be thinking about right now? By sharing these stories and doing it often and doing it transparently, we can transform our culture and practice. A lot of times when these kind of financial stories only live with management and the board, it can create a sense of distrust with the rest of the staff, right? Or with volunteers. So if we're able to communicate transparently, then we build trust and it increases confidence in management. So that's one bucket, our internal audiences. The second bucket is external audiences, our funders, our partners, our clients, all of our external community stakeholders. For them, because they're not living in our world, usually when we're in an organization, we know exactly why our mission is so important. But people outside our organization might not share our point of view. So for them, we want to demonstrate the need and the context. What is it about our work that's so important? Why are we good stewards of their resources? We also might want to tell these stories simply to support compliance and reporting. Every contract requires us to tell some sort of a financial story. And by doing that, we, again, increase confidence in management. I'll share a quick story about this where this went horribly awry. I worked with an organization almost 17 years ago now, and they were having some financial challenges, nothing too major. And so they didn't tell anyone about it. They figured that they could get by just fine. And then the economic crisis of 2008 hit. And that small financial challenge became quite significant to the point that the organization was looking at perhaps needing to close its doors. And they went to their funders to explain where they were. Some of the funders were okay and kind of understood the gravity of the situation and were very forbearing. But some of the funders' first question was, why didn't you come to us sooner? They looked at the numbers and they saw that there had been financial challenges even before the downturn in 2008. And so because this organization had chosen not to transparently communicate where they were as an organization, that really impacted the confidence that those funders had in management. And it took years to repair those relationships. Another way to look at this with these audiences, what are the conversations we're having with each one? What are the questions we're asking? And what are the questions that we are being asked? If we're talking to our donors and funders, we may be talking about helping them understand the financial impact of our world on our business model and sharing specific needs, right? And it can also be nice to give them the chance to share with you what they're seeing among their cohort of grantees, right? Among all the different people that they fund. But the idea is we need them to understand how your organization is specifically being impacted by the evolving reality around us. When we're talking to our board, it might be about outlining organizational priorities, making sure, again, that their attention is directed in the most powerful way possible. And we might want to discuss how you can use reserves or debt to support short and long-term needs, right? A lot of times boards of directors are reticent to touch reserves, but if we can make the case that it's okay to use them to get through a rainy day period or to plug a cash flow challenge, then they're much more likely to approve the use of those funds. And talking to the staff, we might want to be talking about the way these financial decisions might impact their personal and professional lives. And we definitely want to keep everyone up to date on response, recovery efforts, the ways that we're pivoting, the different scenarios that are under consideration. And in talking to our community and partners, talking about how our work and collaboration might need to change. Where are the opportunities to work differently with your community, either with them directly or with other organizations in the community, in order to really support your mission, right? I want to share a tool with you that is incredibly powerful in terms of thinking about your audience and, really importantly, meeting them where they are and figuring out where we want them to get by the end of the story, whether you're speaking with them in person, recording a video, or writing a letter. So this is called the From, To, Think, Do matrix. And we'll start on the upper left-hand corner, right? Along the top, you have from, which is where your audience is starting, and then to, which is where we want them to end up after hearing our story. So in the upper left, we have where are they thinking? Where is their thinking before you connect with them, right? What mindset do they have? What true or false beliefs do they have about the work that you do? Do they believe it's valuable? Do they believe that you are effective stewards of your funding? Whatever it is, where are they starting in terms of their mindset? And then in the lower left, what are they doing or not doing as a result of the way that they're thinking about your work? And we'll look at an example of this in a moment. Then on the other side, at the upper right, we have where we want them to end up in terms of their thinking. What is the shift that we want to create in the way that they see their work and their relationship to it? And then finally, in the lower right, what do we want them to do as a result of that mindset shift? So once you have all this filled out, then your financial story serves as a bridge between the left and the right side of the matrix. Right? Let's look at what this might look like in action. So in this example, the audience is a foundation. And the foundation in question had been supporting an organization for many years with general operating support. And finally, after I think it was 10 years, this is a real example, the foundation turned down a grant. And the reason that the organization turned down the grant, the foundation turned down the grant, and if we look at the upper left-hand corner, that's where this is that they believed and actually had a policy that if an organization had more than 6 months of reserves in the bank, it does not need grant support. right? And as a result of that mindset, moving to the lower left, they declined the grant after many years of consistent general operating support, right? So their mindset is, if you have this much money in the bank, you don't need support. And as a result, they didn't support the organization. So then moving over to the right side, where this organization wanted to get the foundation to was understanding that because this organization was 100% privately funded, their funding went in almost like a sine wave, right? It went in peaks and valleys. And it so happened that when they were audited at the end of their fiscal year, they were flush with cash, right? They had almost, I think, 13 months of cash in the bank, right? But if they took that picture 3 or 4 months later, they'd see a much lower level of reserves, but because the organization used their reserves as an internal line of credit during cash flow dips throughout the year, right? And so what they wanted the organization to do as a result of this new understanding was to release funds and approve the grant, and at a broader level that would hopefully benefit everyone, revisit the foundation's giving policies, right? Because those policies were based on an incomplete understanding of the diversity of business models that organizations have. So this story has a happy ending. The foundation was extremely receptive. This scenario never really occurred to them, and they agreed to release the funds. They approved the grant, and they did revisit their foundation giving policies, right? So this is an example of a financial story about a business model changing the operating reality of a philanthropic foundation and leading to greater support for the organization itself. So what I'd love for you to do is, in a moment, maybe hit pause on this and take a moment to do one of these from, to, think, do matrices for any audience that you communicate with, right? It could be a board member, it could be your staff, a foundation. And often when we go through this exercise, there are some aha moments, right? Little revelations, things we hadn't considered about where they're starting out and the potential our story could have to actuate a shift in their thinking and in their actions and decisions. I hope you took a moment to do that. If so, welcome back. And now that we've talked about our audience, no story is complete, financial story or otherwise, without a call to action. And kind of the low-hanging fruit of calls to action is money, right? We need money. But there are all sorts of other calls to action that you can make for your audiences, right? And these go into the 4 areas of strength that our organizations may have. So some examples of calls to action may be not new funding, but flexibility of funding, right? Releasing restrictions on funding, advancing already committed funds. We might ask for input and insights, materials, relationships, either to other funders, relationships to volunteer organizations, relationships to potential board members. Particularly now, everything is shifted online. We may ask for connections to people with skills in building online curriculum or online course design, right? We may ask for space, specific actions. We may ask for time. For example, if we're reaching out to vendors, we may ask for a little bit more time to pay our bills if we're having a bit of a cash flow challenge, right? So all of these are examples of calls to action that go beyond simply asking for money, although we certainly do want to do that sometimes. So with all of that in place, we have the types of financial story that we need to tell, the information to get it. We've analyzed our audience. We've developed our call to action. Let's look at how we might put these pieces together. And we'll look at this for a few different audiences, but the basic template is always the same. We'll want to start with our mission and our impact, reminding our audience who we are and what's amazing about us. Once we've done that, we want to talk about what happened. What is the event that caused us to make a shift or caused us to make a decision? How did we respond to that event? What was the effect of that response on our mission? In other words, a thing happened, we responded to it, and here's what happened as a result of that. And once we've done all of that, Then we get to our call to action. We express our need, right? Because we've connected with them, we've made sure that they understand why we need what we need. And then finally, we make our specific, meaningful, and actionable call to action. So let's look at a few examples. The first, telling your financial story to a funder. And we'll go through this in a fair bit of detail, right? Number one, we're leading with our mission. So since 2000, Awesome Organization, not its real name, has demonstrated improvements in classroom behavior and attendance through arts and cultural programming during school. That is their core mission, and they've done it. But they've even gone further and successfully advocated for more public spaces, which has transformed the corridor. So this is an organization that has a deep, long-standing relationship and impact with their community, an organization that has gone above and beyond in the pursuit of its mission. So number two, what happened? City-mandated COVID-19 closures interrupted programs. And this, combined with the cancellation of our gala, resulted in a 50% loss in revenue, right? So here we have the event, the city-mandated closures, and the result of that being the cancellation of the gala and the 50% loss in revenue. That is significant. Then in number three, they go into the response. We pivoted all of our education programs online. We've translated all of these COVID-19 materials for local communities. We've even asked our gala attendees to convert advanced commitments into donations and changed it into a giving drive, which closed the gap by 25%. They've also secured the PPP loan, right? So they have not been idle. They've done everything they possibly can to identify where the deficits were in their business model with all of these changes and move to plug that gap, right? They've deepened connections with the community, now moving to number four. But without this giving drive, without our PPP loan, we would have had to reduce operations by a half. We wouldn't have been able to pivot quickly. And even now, and now we're starting to move into the need, even now, the restrictions on our grants are making it challenging for us to consider necessary adaptations to the way we deliver services. So the problem is, even after everything they've done, they have these restricted grants, they can't touch those funds, and it's making it difficult for them to adapt adequately. So now in number five, we have the ask. Given this uncertainty, we're asking for flexibility. Can you release the restrictions on this grant based on what we know that will allow us to meet safety guidelines to deliver the program, right? So we've created all of the context and made a really compelling case, not just to release the funds, but we've shown that the organization is a really effective, powerful, strategic steward of those funds, right? They're doing everything they possibly can in the midst of unpredictable and almost impossible situations, right? So that's how we might tell this story for this organization to a funder. Let's see how it shifts with a different audience. So now talking to the board of example, the board of directors. Again, number one, almost exactly the same. Since 2000, Awesome Organization has demonstrated improvements, et cetera, and so on. That what happened is exactly the same. These two things probably aren't ever going to change that much. And looking at the response, right, is also the same. Education programs are now online. Their response is the same. The board and the funders have the exact same information in numbers 1, 2, and 3. Number 4, it starts to shift. And in this example, you'll see that the board is getting more detailed information. We're having good conversations about our future. However, based on our worst case scenario, which we did not share with the foundation, we anticipate a cash flow gap of $50,000 specifically in November. Year-end giving should put us back on track in terms of managing cash flow by January, and we're making a bigger push this year, right? So the challenge that we're presenting to the board is very specific. It's about a $50,000 cash flow gap in November. And so to plug that cash flow gap in number 5, the need, a multi-pronged approach, very specific. First, do you have any connections to local banks to help us apply for a line of credit, right? We're not asking the board directly for money, but rather for relationships that will help us secure outside bridge money to plug that cash flow gap. Second, would you consider increasing and/or expediting your year-end giving to October, again, so we can avoid that $50,000 shortfall in November? And lastly, just in case, Do you have any other suggestions to consider? So notice with the board, the information we give them is a little bit different because our ask is different. And again, we're not necessarily asking them for money. We're asking for relationships, and we're asking for their creativity. Let's look at one more example how this situation in storytelling might look a little bit different if we were communicating with the staff. And in this case, asking a staff member for specific action. So again, number 1, number 2, number 3 are all exactly the same. And notice how different number 4 is, the effect on the mission. The staff, quick actions allowed us to deepen our community relationships and avoid drastic reductions in our operations. We've gotten closer as a team. Your ideas have been amazing. I really appreciate how adaptable you've been. So after that expression of gratitude, now we move to the need. We need to ask the ABC Foundation to release restrictions on the grant. Could you please share the budget progress to date for XYZ program based on what we know today? Without a release, we may need to give some of the funds back or be unable to spend it until next year. This will also help me with scenario planning. I love this example. So in my deep, dark past, I did a lot of grant writing, was on staff as a grant writer for quite a few organizations. And one of the things that would always drive me up the deep end is when executive director would come in frantic and ask me for a budget year-to-date report, something really hard to find, and it needed to be done like 2 hours ago, right? Not only did this breed resentment, because I had no idea why they were asking for it, right? It led to a sense of distrust. So anytime that the executive director asked me for anything, I was like constantly on edge. And I think that that sense of tension between staff and leadership is not that uncommon, unfortunately, right? So this type of communication might take a couple minutes longer, right? To really contextualize it and make it clear why we're asking for the budget progress to date, for example. But it saves a ton of time on the back end by, again, building trust and transparency between all the members of the team. To sum all this up, communicate early and often. There's been some questions that have come up, especially over the past year, that because there's so much uncertainty, maybe the only thing we have to communicate is we don't know what's going on. To that, I'd say you always know something, whether it's simply the amount of cash you have in the bank or what scenarios you're looking at. So when you communicate, particularly with staff, particularly with board, my suggestion is to always start with what you know and then lay out what you don't know, and then perhaps make a call to action or solicit their input, right? That goes to maintaining a dialogue with all of our partners and constituents, right? What's known, what's unknown, what are our options? As we talked about before, staying in front of funders with our story, especially when things are shifting, reaching out proactively. Don't just wait until your annual report or your grant report is due. The worst that can happen is they won't read it. Sharing your experience and insights with your network and with stakeholders is so important right now. We're in such an uncertain and unprecedented time. I know those have become cliches over the past year and a half or so, but we really are all in this together. And so if you've discovered something, if something's worked really well for you, share it with your network, share it with stakeholders, and ask them to do the same so that we can all navigate our way through this together. And by doing so, that's part of advocating for a more equitable and effective system and supporting policies, right? As we've talked about in this webinar series, the system that we are working inside of, right, the not-for-profit system, the economics of it, are by nature inequitable, right? That's how it was designed. When we tell our financial story, when we do it as a collective, then I can tell you from conversations I've had with funders that philanthropy starts to notice, right? And so I'm not suggesting that this is squarely on the nonprofit, not-for-profits shoulders as storytellers, right? We're also doing this work on the other side of the aisle with funders. But the more we tell our story, the more we get it out there, and the more they hear similar stories from organizations from all different parts of the sector, then the more effectively we're advocating for sector-wide change. So again, there's a lot of information in these webinars. And a beautiful opportunity to kind of sit with it for a moment is to take a moment and write down one piece of information that you learned from today's session, right? From this webinar, one nugget that might be useful. And then as we went through the information, maybe something elicited an aha or some kind of emotional response. So check in with yourself and see how you're feeling. Maybe write that down. And again, there's no judgment on any of these things. We're simply creating a little bit of space for reflection before we close out. And then finally, what specific concrete action might you take to bring some of this information, some of these suggestions, some of these tools back to your community, whether it's that rubric we looked at the very beginning about how to facilitate a powerful conversation, whether it is the from, to, think, do matrix or the outline of the story, whatever it is, what is one action, one thing you can take back to your organization and your community? And from here, Christine in the next webinar is going to talk about the economics of partnership and collaboration. There's been a trend for a few years, and especially over the past 2 years, for organizations to work together in new ways. And so we'll look at ways to do that that are helpful and productive and support the business model of everybody involved. And again, Christine Alvarez will be your facilitator for that. Here's where we are in the webinar series. We've just told our financial story, and we've got 2 more left: economics of partnership and collaboration and understanding full cost. We really, really hope that these webinars are useful to you. And as you have questions, if you'd like to go deeper, go to the website nff.org, and you'll find a host of tools there right on the homepage. There's a button that says tools. It may say COVID-19 resources, depending on when you're watching this. And those are there for you to help deepen your understanding. Again, thank you for devoting your time and spending time watching this webinar. Hopefully it's useful. We know how busy your lives are and really appreciate you spending time with us, investigating and exploring, telling your financial story. Thanks very much. Be well.